Helping to also lead to this progressive movement forward were the muckraking journalists, which I'm sure you've read about in your history class. The most famous being Upton Sinclair with his work The Jungle on the Chicago meatpacking industry. But you also had Ida Tarbell talking about Standard Oil, you had Lincoln Steffens with The Shame in the Cities, talking about these conditions, Jacob Riis with How the Other Half Lives. Muckrakers were progressivism's shock troops. And the argument, the logic behind their work was, if we can inform the American public, let them see what's happening, let them see what the wrongs are, then people will naturally, because it's the right thing to do, but also out of their own self-interest, they will want these wrongs to be righted. And so as such, we see these political reformers and literary talents all coming together to try to change the nature of the business, change the nature of society in many ways. Now, how are these societies changed? We're going to start with many levels, but we can start at state, local, and national level with governmental reform. When it comes to governmental reforms, some of these were items that did have their origins in the Gilded Age. The idea of maybe competitive examinations, like the Pendleton Act from the federal government, some of that begins to get applied at the state and local level, having competitive civil service exams to make the idea to prevent boss rule or city machine rule, have certain jobs within the city, like the head of the water treatment facility, the head of streets and sanitation, the head of buildings and grounds of the engineering department for building the bridges and roads, have that be someone who's actually qualified in that area. Take competitive examinations to find the position. So we take away from, it's an anti-patronage, anti-machine move, takes away from patronage and nepotism. What you know starts to become more important than who you know in certain jobs. As you begin to seek out in the city commission and city manager model, jobs at the municipal level based on persons with technical expertise as opposed to political connections. Robert LaFolle of Wisconsin, the governor, championed this at the state level with the so-called Wisconsin idea, which was involving lobbying restrictions, election reforms, bringing direct democracy to the people, the ideas we saw that the populists try to champion, the initiative, where the people could suggest a law, have it put on the ballot for an up or down vote, the referendum, where the legislature would have a law but wouldn't automatically pass it, would put it to the people for an up or down vote from them as opposed to them voting on it, the recall, where corrupt or politicians who were lacking or substandard could be recalled from office ahead of the expiration of their term, have a snap election and call them before their term is over because that's what the people would want. Putting power into the hands of the people. That is all very much part of the ideas of these laws of this time. Direct election of senators does the same thing. As you remember from your Constitution courses in your high schools and also from the earlier things you've done, the founders distrusted direct democracy. They originally built the Constitution having the people in the state legislatures of each state, the people in the state capitals, choose who the senators were, keeping that one step removed from the masses. Direct election of senators would be a way for the progressives to get more power into the hands of the people to do things as the people's voice dictated versus getting to the elites who could be bought by corporate America in the state houses and pick the guy that they had preferred. Major areas of progressive reform would then involve all aspects of life in many ways, social life beyond just simply governance. Temperance or prohibition, which is an idea we'd seen since the 1820s or 1830s, is going to come and rise to its manifestation in many ways during this era. We're going to see prohibition start at the state and local levels with Neil Dow and the Maine laws from an earlier chapter, earlier reviews, working its way through more and more of the states becoming dry during this time. As these states become dry during this time, they're going to actually start this as a grassroots up movement, which will culminate in the 18th Amendment of 1920. So prohibition, the idea being alcohol and alcoholism led to absenteeism. It was corrosive to the family. The language that is spoken of in the so-called war against drugs today was very much the language of the war against alcohol. Alcohol destroyed the family. It destroyed the social cohesion of society. It led to greater absenteeism. It led to violence. It led to disease. It led to the destruction of people's lives. And so therefore, it should be done away with. So temperance prohibition, child labor, the progressives were very much against this. Instead of child labor, the progressives felt children should be in school. Once again, the progressives were going to use school too, the idea being use education and knowledge to give people and give the middle class a voice in why policy and politics in the nation ought to change. And so learning should begin to focus on personal growth. John Dewey is instrumental in this movement, Charles Eliot of Harvard, same kinds of ways. They were trying to pioneer elective courses, remodify and structure the American university model along the elective model with a series of majors, and you begin to find people who are experts in areas, and the idea is to also push people, not just at the university level, but at the primary and secondary level, get students into schools, get them off the streets, get them out of the workplace, and get them into schools. It's not a coincidence that organized labor would also champion this. Every time a child is not working in a factory, that's one more job than an adult male could get. And so organized labor very much fell in line with this as well. Women's rights, we're seeing that during this era, women were changing in terms of their roles. They were still working. Women in America had always worked, but there's a new set of fields for them to go into. Clerical fields, typing, bookkeeping fields, middle fields within the office of working for middle managers within the office. And so women will still be in subservient roles, but there'll be different roles besides just servants and laundresses and cooks and teachers at the elementary level, etc. They still hold the lowest paying and least opportune jobs, but they are going to move on in terms of having more access into the corporate workforce. And suffrage, the right to vote, is going to be pushed very strong this period that we've seen all the way since the last Great Reform period, 1848 in Seneca Falls, into women culminating in getting their right to vote, ultimately with the 19th Amendment that we see in 1920. The settlement house movement, a way to help take immigrants to the United States in these big cities who lived in these tenements, these high-rise housing projects, if you will, these high-rise low-income housing areas where they were crammed in with poor sanitation, poor living conditions, give public health reform clinics for these immigrants, give them classes on sanitation, classes on domestic science, classes on cooking, and classes on how to get the best for their dollar, classes on education, basic literacy, basic English training. Jane Addams and Lillian Wald are perhaps the two most famous of the advocates of the settlement house movement. Jane Addams with Hull House in Chicago, and Lillian Wald in New York. We see them trying to give these as opportunities to ease the transition for immigrants into daily life in American society from the world from which they came, which was very much part of the social gospel, which we'd seen in earlier chapters and reviews. The idea that it was our duties to sort of, fight for the poor. It was our Christian duty to use the modern phrase that you see from place to place, the idea of what would Jesus do, WWJD. The social gospel is sort of the 19th century equivalent of that it's our Christian duty at a time when we were a highly Christian nation to help out our fellow man and woman, to be our brother's keeper, if you will, as opposed to simply just make a whole lot of money, live a good life, and be content with that and simply go to church every Sunday. It's fighting an active struggle to help uplift society. Progressives, as we said, were optimist doers, and so this was very much part of their elements of what they were up to. In terms of racial anti-discrimination efforts during this era, we'd seen a divergence or a split in the direction to go among the African American community. Initially, Booker T. Washington argues for the idea of self-help. Stay where you are, accommodation on the part of blacks to what whites are doing in society. Help yourself where you are. The idea of having job training, the ability to have a trade is more important than being able to vote, was the argument of Booker T. Washington. The new generation of African American reformers that comes out in the progressive era, they're far more activist. They argue that Washington's approach is sort of a sellout. They argue that African Americans should assert themselves, they should agitate for political and economic rights because the Constitution and law calls for them. It says you should have them, you shouldn't ask nicely for something that's an inalienable right. The second wave is led in many ways by W.E.B. Du Bois, and is the group that founds, after the Niagara Conference, founds the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, to use legal means where possible to end racial discrimination. Also in this era of progressive reform, we're seeing reform for African Americans also move to an urban model, because the 1900s to the 1920s is the era of the first great wave of black migration into American cities for jobs, for employment, to escape the Jim Crow South, and also once World War I starts, to gain war labor, as many of the white individuals in the society, white males, were in the army or were overseas. So we're seeing the first movement into urban America, the first significant movement by African Americans, and we're already seeing a growing and booming urban America with the immigration and the industrialization. So it's about kind of working very hard in these areas to try to, in this urban worldview, improve and modify all aspects of fundamental life, from political corruption to sanitation and health of living conditions, to education, equal access to opportunities, to equality of access for race and gender issues.